2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy.
Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest tonight is Kendra Bossig. She is the assistant curator at the 45th Infantry Division Museum in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And we're going to have a great discussion tonight talking about stuff the museum's up to, her career, and also the 45th Infantry Division, which does not get anywhere near as much attention as it should. So, Kendra, thank you for coming to the show tonight.
Well, thank you for so much for having me. It's an honor.
And just so everyone knows, if you want to follow her on Instagram, she's also on there as Patriot Dame, and it's one of the best Instagram accounts out there. It's a lot of fun. So definitely I want to give her that plug as we jump into this. So let's talk about the 45th Infantry Division, number one. For those who don't know, because everyone's like, hey, Big Red won 101st Airborne since Band of Brothers, 82nd Airborne, but I hate to say it, like the cool guys in the room. 45th Infantry Division, 511 days in combat, 7 medals of honor, countless other valor awards for their troops. I think they took 14,000 casualties, and I want to say 8 campaigns from Sicily all the way through the end of the war, and more than 1 invasion credit. Sicily, Italy. So just an amazing combat record in World War II. They subsequently had an equally distinguished but shorter record in Korea, and then they were the National Guard division for Oklahoma up until I believe the 90s. Kendra's going to give us the word on that, but just we really are going to start by talking about 45th ID. So what is it about 45th ID that you find interesting to curate, promote, do exhibits for, Ms. Kendra? Like, what is the linchpin of 45th ID as far as you're concerned when you're doing stuff in the museum?
For me, it's always about those personal stories and making those connections. It's so easy when you're going to a military museum and it's firearms and field artillery and uniforming, and all of those things are pretty standard across the board. They look the same because they're supposed to be uniform. But for me, going back and finding those stories and connecting those 2 locations and different pieces within our collection is what really gets me excited. And that way we can tell those stories to people who come and visit. And with the National Guard, I always think, and I always like to remind people that these people are our neighbors, our family members, our coworkers, our friends, our neighbors. And, what they do overseas has been great, but what they do here stateside is equally as important. And we very often gloss over their contributions to our community and our state and our country.
And that's fantastic. The National Guard connection is so critical, since it was a National Guard division and filled with people who were essentially part-time soldiers until the balloon went up in World War II. And so in this instance, it's definitely like a community museum as well. I mean, you probably have descendants of a lot of the folks who are members of the division coming to the museum. Is there that kind of community connection?
Oh, all the time. I actually had a woman come in this morning and asked me if I had any information on her grandfather, who was a medic during World War II. And I was like, well, no, unfortunately, we don't have those records. Those are scattered at various places around the country, as everyone else's records are as well. But I get, so frequently people bring pictures along with them of their family members or themselves. And we're in a historic building, and they had officer candidate school out of there for years. So we'll have people come in and be like, my bunk bed was next to that fireplace. So it's a community oriented type feeling that we get all the time. And I love hearing people's stories. And the museum was really founded by 45th veterans from World War II, as they kind of used it as their clubhouse, and they realized the importance of preserving the history of the division. So they got together in the late 60s, and by the mid 70s, they had the museum open.
That is fantastic. Now you've opened up at like three different lines of inquiry. So the first thing that came to mind is are you in any way formally affiliated with the Oklahoma National Guard right now, either through funding, sponsorship, or even just co-promoting events or anything of that nature?
We are part of the Oklahoma National Guard. So our funding comes from them and the state of Oklahoma as well. And so when we're building a new museum, so we're in the design process right now, and everybody's really excited and very involved in what's going on, and everybody has so many ideas right now. It's fascinating to watch the process roll along.
Okay, that's really exciting. So then the second line of inquiry, it was you said it's an historic building, and OCS was run there. So this was a building that's obviously owned by the state of Oklahoma. It's part of the National Guard establishment. Was it part of the 45th Infantry Division's training infrastructure, or was this separate from 45th ID and it just became available?
So the building was actually built in 1936. It was a WPA project. And it was built to be like an officers club, but because Oklahoma was a dry state up into the 50s and it was the Great Depression and Oklahoma was hit very hard by that, the local community was not very happy to find out that's what they were building. So they tacked on an armory and they turned it into the headquarters for the division. And it was that for a good long while.
Oh, wow, that's really cool. So you're actually displaying history in the history itself. So that's just
Yes, and
exciting.
it's a neat building. It's got a chalet theme, and our big hall that you walk into would have been the dance floor, and where our archival library is the bandstand. So the building has so much character itself. It's a museum all in its own right.
That's awesome. That's really exciting. And the third line of inquiry, tying it back in with the community, people who either were directly involved with the division or descendants. Do you still have any surviving members of the division from World War II that are affiliated with the museum who might come out? I know we're losing our World War II veterans at an alarming rate, although I don't want to sound macabre or casual about it. It's kind of understandable as they're coming in to be, 100, 101 years old on average. However, I'm just curious if there are any remaining veterans of the division that you guys still might be able to do events with, or even just keep in touch with.
Unfortunately, we lost one of our volunteers, our last World War II veteran volunteer last winter, Harley Richards, who was just a gem. He was great. He had great stories, and he was just, I just loved him. So his passing hit us all pretty hard. But there are a few others. I know Orrin Peters, and he's 102.
Oh my
And
gosh.
he comes up every month. We host the Military Order of the World Wars monthly lunch, excuse me, on the first Thursday of every month. And he's usually there, and he's sharp as a tack still and gets around great. And we just love seeing him. He's great.
That's outstanding. It's so cool that you guys have this connection with the community and with the veterans still. And it's part of what obviously makes this such a vibrant museum. Now, a couple of things I learned in my very cursory research. You guys have the largest collection of memorabilia associated with Hitler. Is this like an established fact kind of thing? It was on the Wikipedia page, so it's got to be true.
It is true. There are larger collections out there, just not on public display.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah. And actually, Orrin Peters' older brother, he's the one who got a lot of that stuff out of his apartment in Munich. There's a picture on Time magazine of him lounging on kind of a chaise lounge in Hitler's apartment, and it was on the cover of Time. And so, yeah, that was his brother. And so, yeah.
That is so cool. And it's interesting too, because when you think about it, and I hadn't even thought about it in this context, and I like to think I'm kind of a smart guy. Obviously, as the leader of the Third Reich, Hitler had many residences, throughout Germany. Everybody thinks, again, we get back to Band of Brothers, 101st, Eagle's Nest. Oh, here's where all the cool stuff was, and they get it home. Obviously the Führer's property is all over that country, so all that kind of stuff must have been falling into GI's hands. So, and then, as you said here, there's a big magazine spread showing that these veterans or these troopers at the time are getting their hands on this stuff. So as you guys are building this collection, or even before you became affiliated with the museum, were people just like, oh yeah, I think I got something in a rucksack back in the attic, I'm going to send it into the museum? Or was there, and the collection just grew organically? Or was there hey, let's get our hands on as much as we can? Like, was there a concerted effort to build this big display? Or how did this come about that suddenly you had more than anyone else on display?
That's a good question. And I've heard stories over my time of being at the museum, is that they would, some of them had just picked things up, and there were more pieces that they would just use these things, servingware and tableware. We've got a couple of tablecloths. We got some more stuff in holding that we don't have out on display right now, actually. And they would just use these things for their, 4th of July barbecue, and nobody think anything of it. And they were like, oh yeah, our soon to be new, I guess our new curator, he was just like, oh yeah, he's like, they used to use those things just at their parties and stuff, just very casually. And then when they started getting older, some of them started donating some of the pieces into the collection. So yeah, we have a kind of a smattering of things. We have some linens, glassware, table service type things like that. Copy of Mein Kampf, and
So,
bunch of other random things.
what would you say the most surprising or oddest thing is in that collection? Just like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that there would be, Hitler's toothbrush, or what have you. Is there something particularly crazy that's like, oh my gosh, what is that?
I think that the piece that gets the most attention is the mirror that was in the bunker.
Oh wow.
Was picked up by a member of the 45th. He went over and talked to some Soviet troops, and he was like, "Hey, is there anything left in there?" And they're like, "Take whatever you want." And he took the mirror, so we have that out. And people are always telling me how creepy it is, and I'm like, "Well, I check my hair in there all the time," but I don't think anything of it anymore because I've been there for over 4 years now. So
I mean, that is low key creepy though. As soon as you said it, like anything associated with the bunker, I got a little chill at the base of my spine. I can understand why people might think that's a little creepy, because you've got, you're looking into what was the reflection of this man who, that's the less said, the better. But that is so cool that you guys have been able to build this collection. And not only because it's fascinating in its own right, but because of that, again, getting back to that community connection, like, oh yeah, here's the barbecue tongs that we used at the 4th of July celebration that we, liberated from Hitler's apartment. That's amazing to me. That is so interesting. Now, with it being the largest collection of Hitler memorabilia on display, is it the largest display in the museum, or what is the largest display in the museum? Do you guys rotate exhibits? Do you guys have standing exhibits? How are y'all laid out, and how do you lay out the history of the division and its contribution and connection with the people of Oklahoma? Like, just kind of give us a verbal tour, if you will.
Little rundown. So our front gallery starts basically pre-statehood, kind of Spanish conquistador time.
Oh wow, we're going way back.
I kind of think it's a miss, and because I'm just like, well, this really it's too far back. But there's a little case, and it kind of walks you through Trail of Tears, resettlement, the 5 civilized tribes here in Oklahoma, pre-statehood, little bit on the Civil War, some stuff about the Spanish-American War. Quite a few of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders were from Oklahoma and Texas. So when they had their reunions here for a couple of years after the war, early 1900s. And then we kind of have a case on Pancho Villa and being down on the Mexican border because they were sent down there. And then you flip around to World War I, which was before the division was created. Texas and Oklahoma were part of the 36th, which we know is now just the Texas National Guard. So, and then we kind of roll on to those interwar years, and then you hook around and you get the big World War II. So we kind of have a small room on that. And then we have Korea, and then we have a very large firearms collection, military small arms, from the American Revolution up to the Persian Gulf War, I think. And that was a private collection. We have Bill Mullen's cartoon collection. We have most of his original works that he did for the Division News and Stars and Stripes during World War II.
So I know I asked you to give us the virtual tour, but I stop here on the tour for a minute. Let's talk about Bill Mullen.
Oh yeah. Gosh,
his connection with it. A lot of people loved his cartoons. I was a big fan of Willie and Joe. My grandfather had a book of his cartoons, which I learned more about World War II history as a child from reading the cartoons than I did from any class that I ever took. So do you guys have any display specifically devoted to him, like a little corner or something, some photographs as well as some of his artwork? And also, before we go down that rabbit hole too far, for those of our listeners who don't quite know who Bill is, if you could give us a rundown of what he was all about and why he's so important to the division's history.
So yeah, Willie and Joe are iconic. It just kind of started when he was working. They pulled him off to do the Division News. He was an artist. They had several artists that they, just made newspapers. That's just what they did. And his cartoons really, I would say, show a very realistic, sometimes humorous, sometimes not humorous at all, the day-to-day life of the common infantryman. We're not talking about officers, or it's not glamorized or anything, but it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. And like I said, they pulled him off the division news, and they published in Stars and Stripes, and he won a Pulitzer Prize he was in his early 20s then, which is, huge. And then he went on to have a very prolific career. I think the other half of his collection and his later works that he did, I think, I swear I'm gonna mess this up. I did Washington Post. I should know this. Is at the Pritzker Museum in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they actually had a touring exhibit last year, and I was fortunate enough to get to go up to the Eisenhower Presidential Library. They were hosting it up there, so that's not too far from here and really close to my family. So
that's cool, and that's also an amazing. It's also I had the opportunity to go there like 20 years ago, but I really enjoyed it. That's an amazing layout up there as well.
They've redone it. It's beautiful.
Very cool. Very cool. So anyway, so we move on from Willie and Joe. What else? What do we do next? We roll into Korea on our virtual tour.
Yeah, we can kind of hooks back around. It makes kind of a big loop. And like I said, because it's a historic building, our layout is just all over the place. We jokingly call it the TARDIS of military museums because it looks much smaller on the outside than it is on the inside. So yeah, we have a small area for Korea. We'd like to expand that eventually and kind of pull out that story more and give more detail because, it's kind of the forgotten war. And
yes, ma'am.
I hate to think of it that way because one of my grandfathers served during the Korean War through Vietnam and the Air Force. So, for me and people of, my generation, we have grandparents that served in World War II and Korea. So that's a expanding storyline that's coming along.
Very cool. And we were talking before we started recording that it's a National Guard museum. So obviously you're covering the history of the division when it was made up of citizen soldiers and it wasn't actually federalized and deployed in combat operations. And is it more difficult to curate and create exhibits that aren't built around these big world events? Like, when you're talking about the invasion of Europe and World War II and Hitler, like, okay, people get really fired up. It's kind of less exciting to talk about annual training at Camp Gruber. Like, how do you guys, square that circle?
It can be a little bit difficult. It's like, well, how many photos of training can you put out? And we do have big displays of photos of them training up at Gruber and doing, things like that. And I think that's definitely something that we're working on in earnest right now. It's easy to hit the stateside events of, I would say for us, the Oklahoma City bombing is huge. We haven't really touched on that, but it's really easy to write about. And we have the Oklahoma City Memorial downtown. So we've been working with them and we're trying to figure out something for our new museum to expand on that story. And we can talk about tornadoes, of course, that's huge. Emergency hay drops for cattle and livestock.
Oh, wow. That's something I don't think I've ever heard the term emergency hay drop before, but
I know it's
in the wake of any kind of natural disaster, you got to take care of the livestock.
Oh, absolutely. That's, cattle is king around here. So that's important to remember too. And then I'm trying to think of, I just did a new exhibit in the last case is about what they've done in the past couple of years. So that was for us was COVID and their, deployment to Biden's inauguration after the insurrection on January the 6th. They were only supposed to send a couple of people and then that all happened. So they really upped the numbers and they all went and hearing their stories from that. And, we all heard it's like, oh, they're all sleeping in parking garages and everything. And well, they were, but I haven't heard one negative comment from any of them. They were like, what an honor it was to be able to go and do that. So
that's really cool.
I thought so. I had people are just like, oh, those poor people. And I'm like, well, I'm sure they've slept in worse. In fact, I know they have. So
yes, ma'am. So what did you do to prepare yourself to become the assistant curator? Give us a little bit of your background. I know you have an advanced degree in museum studies. I'd like to hear more about that and how you kind of went down that road and also how you leveraged that background and education to create these wonderful exhibits.
Well, it's kind of funny. I always tell people that how this all started for me is I took a wrong turn coming back from the zoo a couple of years ago. And I knew the museum was there. There are signs out on the highway. And I'm like, we should really go and do that. And we just never did. But one day we're about probably a mile away from Oh, excuse me, my allergies drive me crazy. About a mile away from the zoo. And so we took the wrong turn. I was like, oh my gosh, we have a bunch of equipment outside. We got a 15-acre park just full of macros. So we just like, okay, we're coming back this weekend. And we did. And I just hit it off with our curator, and I've just kind of been there ever since. And they were the ones who really during COVID inspired me to go and work on my master's degree. I have a bachelor's degree in art history. And I took a very long gap between going back to school. It was never anything that I thought I was going to do. But we're just so low on people and, people power to getting things done. They were just like, whatever you want to do around here, do it. So it's always, for me, it's like, well, do I ask permission or do I just go ahead and do it? And that's what it's been. I started with cataloging our collection of uniforms, and it has just snowballed from there. And I wrapped up my master's degree in December, and it was just hey, let's just make this official and get you on the payroll. So
That's exciting. So it sounds like you've so many different things, because you're part historian, you're part anthropologist, you're part art historian, you're part, preserver of material culture. There's like, if there's something that has to be done, you go ahead and do it. But
yeah.
so there's so many different opportunities here. What is it, talking to the young veterans about things like the inauguration? Is it talking to the older generation? Is it getting your hands on the artifacts? What really inspires you about this job?
Oh my gosh, all of it. It's for me, I also do World War II reenacting. We kind of have a loose group associated, we're kind of loosely associated with the museum. But they, that me being at the museum snowballed into that. And I've always been interested in military history. Like both of my grandfathers served. It was always something growing up with my dad. We also would always watch like military old war movies and stuff like that. And so it just kind of snowballed. So for me, it's like, oh, I get to touch all of this stuff. I'm like, woohoo. It's like a kid in the candy store type situation if you like things like that. But yeah, talking to people, because museums are community spaces, and it's so easy that we kind of feel like, oh well, this is ours. But really, a museum is a space for a community to come together, whether that's your local community or for people from farther abroad. We have people visit us from all over the world, and we're there to, further the mission of the Oklahoma National Guard and tell those stories. So yeah, getting to talk to people is it's huge.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So what is the aside from the Hitler stuff, which I think we've kicked that horse enough, what is the coolest artifact you've actually been able to touch, interact with? Is there something in particular, like, oh my goodness, this, the provenance of this thing, and it has a story, or is it all wonderful?
Oh, it's so hard to pick because we have just a smattering everything. I mean, we have uniforms from the Spanish-American War up till now. So it's like, for me, I'm a big Spanish-American War nerd. That's why I wrote my undergrad thesis on, was propaganda posters during the war. And so for me, I was like, the first time I went upstairs, I was like, oh my gosh, like, but oh God, I don't know. And yeah, we have tons of uniforming, so many just little things that you wouldn't think anything of unless you knew what it was. There's an empty bottle of Cointreau that's in our collection, and that has its own story of them finding this warehouse full of liquor in Germany at the very end of the war, and going over there and loading up a bunch of Jeeps and like tanking it back and then going back and getting more. And so we have this bottle, and we have a picture of them standing there holding that Cointreau bottle.
That's cool.
Yeah.
It's always neat when you can link the photographic evidence or testimony.
Oh, that's my favorite.
That is fantastic. So one of the things that sounds really exciting is that you'd mentioned before we hit record was that the 45th Infantry Division Museum is going to be transitioning to become the Oklahoma National Guard Museum. Some of my listeners might know that the 45th Infantry Division has cased its colors, and it's now the 45th Infantry Brigade and also the 45th Fires Brigade, and there's other supporting units in the Oklahoma National Guard, but the division itself is no longer a standing division associated with the National Guard. So it sounds like you guys are, I don't want to say catching up with the times per se, but you're recognizing that, and you're kind of creating a more inclusive environment for the National Guard, or you're just evolving? If you could kind of fill us in on how that decision was made and how you guys are expanding your mission, or maybe you're not expanding your mission, maybe you're already ahead of the curve, but how are you guys dealing with this?
Well, I think it really is just a expanding of the storyline. You can't just stop at, 1952, 53 and just be like, okay, there's nothing else until the global war on terror in the 2000s. There's decades worth of stories in there. And while they're not as exciting or glamorous or have the, patina of time or the romance that, World War II has, there's still important stories to tell. And like I said, lots of stateside duty and training, which isn't the most exciting all the time, but very impactful events that have happened in this state and the state history that, we think are worthy of telling.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about as well, people who have been paying attention know that certain installations in the United States Army have undergone name changes in the past year, and there's one name very much associated with the 45th Infantry Division, Van T. Barfoot, Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. Fort Pickett in Virginia has been renamed in his honor. So were you guys consulted about that? Were
Yes.
you part of that process at all? Or is that just a happy coincidence as far as y'all are concerned?
As the museum side, no. I think that there was some consulting deeper in the Guard, with public affairs and our AG office. I'm pretty sure, but we were very excited to hear about that. I personally think it's a good change. I'm from the South, and my family is from Central Texas, so very close to Fort Hood, and so. A little roll with the times here, but all very worthy people. So
And you hit the nail on the head. If you just want to separate the politics from it
yeah.
and realize that the people who were selected to be honored with their name being associated with a poster installation, I can't think of a better representative of the infantry than Van Barfoot, for example. So regardless of how his name became associated with the former Fort Pickett, he's a very deserving individual, and I really encourage all the folks who are listening to check out his Medal of Honor citation, because he's just an amazing man. And
Oh yeah.
and just a fantastic representative of the 45th Infantry Division. So I think that's wonderful. The last point I wanted to bring up was you had briefly touched on the Oklahoma City bombings and things of that nature. And have you found it's more difficult, not just because, it's not as interesting per se, but even when you're talking to people who are associated with the OKC bombings or associated with the global war on terror, who might have deployed with the 45th Infantry Brigade or 45th Fires, is it more difficult to curate that? Because as you said, that historic lens is not there yet. That patina is not there yet. We're dealing with some very significant emotions, things that might not even have been processed yet. And it's not history yet. Is it difficult for the museum to address those as history, or is there a decision to acknowledge it, but maybe revisit it further down the road? How are y'all handling the more recent history that the soldiers of the Oklahoma National Guard have been involved with?
It's a really interesting way to put it about talking about it, but revisiting it. That's kind of where we're at right now. Our former curator hasn't done very much. His wheelhouse was very World War II centric. So anything else was just kind of like, oh, we'll just kind of throw it together. So we do have a global war on terror exhibit, but it is very much lacking context. And so that's actually kind of my next project that I'm going to work on, and kind of updating where they're at right now, which is over in Djibouti in Africa. So yeah, for me, it's I always kind of think, because I was in high school when 9/11 occurred, and I very distinctly remember that day. And if everybody does, if you were alive during that time and old enough to remember what was going on, like it's so impactful on our lives. So when I start thinking about it, it's just like, okay, how do I approach this where we're telling the facts, but we're also being really sensitive to what's going on, because there are people that were directly impacted by all of this. So it's trying to find that balance between storytelling and remembrance without it becoming just a straight memorial. We want to storytell, we want to get the facts out there, but we also really want to make sure that we're striking the right chord with everybody. And it is a little bit difficult, but I think we've got a really good, strong team. And I think we're going to be able to create something really great as we move forward.
That's really exciting. And I've got two final questions because we're coming up on the end of our time. The first one just occurred to me as you were giving that wonderful explanation. When I was a young man, especially a child, even before I became a soldier, it was always, really exciting to, kind of press my grandfather for stories, and he would be reluctant to talk about it, and understandably so from his military experiences. But when you look at any type of exhibit from the Second World War, or the celebrations that take place every year in Normandy or in the Netherlands for Market Garden and things like that, through that lens of time, kind of distorts things a little bit. Things become more celebratory, and something's lost, in my opinion, about just how difficult it was for the people who were living at that time. It's something to be memorialized, but sometimes there's a more celebratory aspect that might be there. Has dealing with more recent history, when you're talking with young veterans who participated in those events and you're being sensitive to that, does that change your lens about dealing with artifacts from World War II and people from World War II to kind of give it an immediacy it might not otherwise have because of the amount of time that's passed since those events occurred? Hopefully I made sense with that question.
Yeah, I think that in a way it kind of, not to use the term, humanizes things over again. But when you get those stories and, when you're talking to younger veterans and you're thinking about, people who served during World War II, like, oh my gosh, these were, 17, 18, 19, early 20-year-olds, barely adults. So it's
Yes,
like,
ma'am.
wow, what was I doing in my early 20s? Well, definitely not that. And so for me, it does. It's time marches on, but things don't really change. As much as we would love to see that, we could work together as a global community better. Clearly we're not in some ways. And
Yes, ma'am.
so like for me, it's like, okay, it's the kind of the same thing. It's a little bit different, but just to get those stories as well. And my family kind of jokes that I have the face that people will just come and talk to. They will just tell me their life story all the time. So I get people's stories all the time. And I've gotten a lot of stories over the years, even before I was at the museum, from World War II veterans who have just, I'm going to say, unburdened their stories on me.
Yes, ma'am.
Which is in some cases has been a little bit disturbing, but it's been an honor to be able to be the recipient of that knowledge and be able to take their experiences. And none of them were in the people that I'm thinking of weren't in the 45th, but I'm able to remember that and remember my connection to them and be like, this is why I'm doing this. This isn't about me. This isn't, about my legacy as working in, the museum field or working in a military museum. It is about telling these stories and setting it up for a future generation so we can continue to succeed and push the mission forward.
Oh, there it is in a nutshell. Last question.
All right.
You mentioned the museum in this wonderful old building. Used to be officers club, used to be an OCS building. You mentioned it might be haunted. Can you give us a little bit of give us one ghost story before we go?
Oh, well, I'll give you the most recent one that I was telling you earlier. I was just doing an exhibit install last week and I was looking for something from the 1990s, and I said out loud, I'm like, oh gosh, I just need something from the 90s. I'm like, okay, what can I do? And all of a sudden this lid popped open on this box. It was one of those kind of file boxes that has the little lid, and it just popped open and out rolled this t-shirt and just landed at my feet. There it was.
The ghosts of the division, they deliver.
Era. Yeah, I know. And I said, I was like, thank you. And I very quickly went back downstairs.
If you ever working late, do you ever get kind of a heebie-jeebie, like you're not alone? Like,
oh, it's really funny. And so we have our couple of skeptics, and then we have our full-on believers. And I like to joke that I'm kind of someplace in between a skeptical believer, but we have all heard or experienced strange things. And some of it's probably, just the building. It's from the 30s. It's got its own, noises and everything. But there have been some times where I'm like, well, I don't think I'm clearly alone in here. I think We've had some paranormal groups come in, and we've actually, sadly, I just the other day just had to send some emails out and say, hey, we're not doing this anymore. And it's not that we, don't want people in there. It's just none of us want to be there in the middle of the night.
No, I got you. Exactly. Come on, guys. We've already worked a 12-hour day. No.
Absolutely.
Well,
Come at 5 p.m. when we're closed.
well, thank you very much for these. That's kind of a neat way to close it out. It's the
Fantastic.
skeptical believer. Well, everybody, so this has been Ben Powers coming at you for the Commander's Voice. My guest tonight was the incomparable Miss Kendra Bossig, who has doing fantastic work with the Oklahoma National Guard and the 45th Infantry Division Museum. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Well, you have a wonderful evening, ma'am.
You too.